Welcome to the Chess Angle. This is not your typical chess podcast. If you're an amateur or club-level player, the Chess Angle is for you. Our content is aimed at busy adults who are serious about the game but have limited study time. Featured guests include both amateur and titled players alike. And now, here's your host, Director of the Long Island Chess Club, Neal Bellon.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This was an especially busy week. I'm recording this on a Friday, so it feels good to be in front of the mic after a long week to just sort of decompress and chill out and talk about chess. Yeah, this was a crazy one. So anyway, couple of reminders. You can email me directly, info@thechessangle.com. I would love to hear from you. If you have a question for me or a topic idea for the show, you can also visit our website, thechessangle.com, and click the contact link to message me that way. It's all going to the same place. The best way you can support the show would be to tell your chess playing friends, spread the word on social media, and we would love it if you would take a moment just to give us a 5-star review or rating on your podcast app of choice. It's greatly appreciated. And let's kick this off by going to our listener mailbag.
You've got mail.
All right, here's our first email. Good morning. I'm Reinhard from South Africa. I started listening to the pod 6 months ago. Great pod. A few weeks ago, you spoke about draw offers, and I never thought that much about it. Usually, it was a sign of defeat. My coach said that anyway. I was rated top 4 before the tournament, and the time control was 90 minutes plus a 30-second increment. My first match, I played a reverse London system against the Ready. At move 17, he offered me a draw about 5 times in the match, but my endgame was my strong suit in the match, so I won. Your pod really helped me to acknowledge if I should accept the draw looking at the position or keep going for the win. Thank you for the great pod. Kind regards, Reinhard. Thanks so much, Reinhard. Shout out to our friends in South Africa. Now, a couple of comments there. Now, you said that your coach said that accepting a draw is a sign of defeat, or offering a draw is a sign of defeat. Yes, that's what coaches do. That's what they tell their students. And technically, they're right. And I know they mean well, but what coaches sometimes forget are the realities of playing chess as an adult improver living in the real world. Okay, you might have had an argument with your spouse maybe before the game and you're distracted, or maybe you got an email right before the game that distracted you. Maybe all of a sudden there's a bill you need to pay and you completely forgot about it, and it's a lot of money, and now you're thinking about that and you're distracted. So maybe a draw is the best result. Maybe you're on a team and getting the half point will help your team. Maybe you have an important thing to get up for work the next day, and it's like an 80-move rook and pawn ending where you're just shuffling and you just want the draw because you need to be fresh for work. You know, there is a whole slew of things that could be a reason to accept the draw that have nothing to do with what's on the board necessarily. Yes, you always want to think about the game and the result, but these things happen. And even if you're not distracted, sometimes based on the position and based on your clock, it might be better to take the draw than risk losing the game, especially if you feel you are going to lose. Like, there's a lot of things at play. So when coaches say don't ever offer and accept a draw, technically they're right, but practically speaking, I don't think that always makes sense. I mean, yes, you always want to play for the win. Offering or accepting a draw is always a plan B, but I think there are times occasionally, you know, in maybe 10 to 15% of your games approximately, where it might be a smart choice, depending not only on what's happening on the board or your clock, but what's happening, you know, in your head or what's happening off the board, so to speak. Like, a draw can sort of give you a way out. You're not going to do it all the time. You have to pick your spots, but something to think about. But I know that the standard chess coach playbook says that, you know, tell your students never to offer or accept a draw. Now, the argument that some people say, well, if you take the draw, you're not going to learn anything. You're not going to learn anything if you accept a draw, offer a draw. Here's my problem with that. Let's say it's in an endgame and you're at move like 50 and you agree to the draw. You mean to tell me those 50 moves that were already played, you're not going to learn anything from that? Really? If it's 70 moves in and you accept or offer a draw, you're not going to learn anything from the 70 moves that you already played? And then you can always use the computer to figure out like what could have happened. I don't know, just that argument. I mean, if you accept a draw at move 15, yes, then the argument that you're not going to learn anything is true. But I mean, if you've played at least, say, 30, 40 moves, I mean, you have a lot of material to learn from right there. So anyway, to wrap that up about draw offers, you generally don't want to take them. It's a tool in your toolkit to use occasionally. I've spoken about this over the past few episodes. But the idea of sort of speaking in absolutes that you should never, ever offer or accept a draw, I don't agree with that. But I do agree that you want to avoid it if you can and that it's a plan B. So just some thoughts on draw offers there. Now, what you did in your game, because you have confidence in your end game and you were feeling it, you were absolutely right to go for the win. Like in your specific game that you cited in your email, in that case, yes, absolutely. It would have been wrong to accept the draw. But if you had said, my end game is my strong suit, but, I feel a headache coming on, I'm getting really tired, then maybe it's something you look into. But the way you described it, it was absolutely correct to continue on for the win. And that's awesome that you won the game. In fact, the game I'm going to discuss today, as far as like a draw offer in the end game, that kind of came up. So we're going to talk about that a little later when we get to the game. But thank you so much, Reinhard, for your email and for listening to the pod. Really appreciate it. Our next email is from Shane. He writes, "Hi, Neal. I've been listening to your podcast from the beginning. The information in the podcasts have helped me a lot. I'm a 59-year-old who took up chess more seriously at age 58. I did know the basics before, played some games here and there, and lost more times than won. That has now reversed thanks to more targeted study. Just a thought on a possible podcast, discuss the main ideas and strategies of the top 5 white and black openings. These openings would be for beginners to advanced beginners. This is what I have found hard to find. I took your advice and have a set repertoire of openings. White, primarily the Kali system and occasionally the bird. Black, primarily the Pirc, occasionally the Dutch defense. All the best, Shane from Australia." Well, thanks so much, Shane. Shout out to our friends down under and a couple of comments about your email. Now, as far as me doing a podcast on the quote unquote top openings for white and black, I'm the wrong guy to do that because I'm very biased and fussy with my openings. And a lot of people don't agree with me. A lot of coaches, a lot of players, they're not going to agree with my philosophy. Others will. Many do agree, but many disagree. Now, what do I mean by that? I'm not an E4 person. Obviously, if I were to discuss popular openings for white, I would have to discuss E4 openings. I can't stand opening with E4 as white because you play E4 as white. You have to know like 50 million things. You open with E4 and then black replies E5. What's your plan? E4, E6, the French. What's your plan? E4, C5. Like you're just creating, unless you're playing an E4 system opening, like the King's Indian attack or something, it's just, it's a nightmare. And then responding against E4, I don't believe in replying with E5 as black. Like for me, that's like the dumbest thing on the planet. Like if white plays E4 to respond E5, all right, I'm being dramatic, not the dumbest thing on the planet, but like for me, I'm just not a big fan of replying E5 because those open games, those classic E4, E5 games, it's all theory. It's all this tactics. It's all these traps. And ever since I started playing the London as white, I just haven't had any of those issues. So I'm not really qualified to talk about something like the Roy Lopez or the Sicilian. I mean, the Carol Khan is good. That's mainstream. I don't really play it though, but I'm so set with my openings. I have such a good time playing them. I'm doing well playing them. You're going to see the Queen's Indian defense, which I played in the game we're going to discuss today against a higher rated player. Like I have my pet openings. And even if they know what I'm going to play, because most of the regulars at the club know what I play, it really doesn't matter. That's what I like about my opening repertoire. Even if you think you quote unquote, you're going to prepare for me, it really doesn't matter. So for those who are new to the podcast, what I basically play, this is my own repertoire, and then I'll talk about chains. I play the London system as white. That's all I play. I know, insert wisecrack here. I know people have their thoughts about the London system, but they can go fly a kite because I love it. So that's my complete repertoire for white, which saves me a ton of study time and I can focus on other things. For black, against E4, I play the French defense. And against D4, I use either the Nimzo or the Queen's Indian defenses. And against C4, I usually play B6, although sometimes I'll play knight F6, try to transpose it into a Queen's or a Nimzo. So that's my standard opening repertoire for myself. Now, as for yours, Shane, let's take a look. You play the Kali as white. Great system. For those who don't know, Kali system is an offshoot of the London system. You have that trio in the middle, right? You have the pawns on D4, on C3, on E3. But with the Kali, you're not developing the dark squared bishop to F4. The idea is you get your light squared bishop to D3, you go knight F3, castle, and then the idea is to get in E4, right? So you get that break in the center, and then that opens up the diagonal for your dark squared bishop on C1. So it's kind of like a London system in that it's more about a formation and it's more about where your pieces go. And so there's some variation in the move order. And you do have that little triangle in the middle again on D4, C3, and E3, but your bishop, your dark squared bishop on C1 kind of stays put. In some lines of the Kali, I'm not a Kali expert. I mean, in some lines, I know you'll fiend Keto it on B2. You'll play B3 and then bishop B2. There are some lines, I believe, in the Kali where white will fiend Keto. But normally, again, you try to get in E4. The light squared bishop on D3, again, is a big part of that. Castle's kingside. And that's basically the idea with the Kali. You aim for that structure. Now, you say you played the bird, right? What is that, F4? All right, good for you. I mean, that's an interesting opening. I'm not going to say it's a bad opening. I wouldn't play it myself, but at the amateur level, you can probably get away with it. But you say occasionally the bird, so that's probably something to break out. Now, as black, you say you play the Pirc, good defense. Now, it's spelled Pirc. I believe it's pronounced Pirc, although I've heard many grandmasters even say Pirc. So I don't know if it's Pirc or Pirc. I learned it as Pirc. Tomato, tomato, potato, potato. I'm calling it the Pirc, whatever. You want to call it the Pirc. All right. Anyway, the Pirc, good opening. I mean, you could even play that against D4, right? Because the Pirc or the Pirc, it's generally E4 and then D6, but you can also do D4, D6. It works against a lot of different openings, so that's good. Dutch defense, right? D4, F5, good opening as well. So I like your opening repertoire, but going back to your original request, as far as discussing the top openings for white and black, that might be a good guest episode. But for myself, I'm just so set and so stubborn with my openings. And I'm very anti E4, E5 and D4, D5. And I'm very anti-Sicilian. That's just me, just my opinion. If you play the Sicilian and you're doing well with it, stick to it. All the power to you. If you play E4, E5, whether it's white or black, and you're doing well with it, all the power to you. Don't go by me. All right. I'm just one person. I happen to like system openings and my repertoire works for me. Okay. The repertoire that I stated for myself, for other people, it may not work depending on your skill, your knowledge, your experience, and your personality. All right. Those openings work for me and my personality and my experience. And I messed around with a lot of openings early on until I sort of landed on this. It wasn't like I woke up one day and boom, this is what I played. You know, I got beat up pretty badly when I first started playing in tournaments. And then over a long period of time, I finally settled on the ones that I mentioned. But anyway, appreciate the email, Shane. Great to hear from our friends in Australia. Thanks so much for listening to the pod. I really appreciate it. All right, we're now going to take a short break. And when we come back, I'm going to discuss a recent game that I played at the club that I found to be very instructive. That's coming right up. So a reminder with these game analysis episodes, the idea is not to follow each move and picture each position on the board. It's not like I go move by move. It's not a blindfold chess thing. The idea with these game analysis episodes on an audio podcast is really to discuss themes and ideas. In other words, what did I learn from the game? What can we learn from the game? Specifically, what are the takeaways? What ideas from this game can we use in our chess games in general? What things do I need to remind myself of? What did I do that was good or bad? What did my opponent do that was good or bad? What can we learn from it? That's really what these are about. However, if you want, there is a PGN in the show notes of the game, so you can put it in an engine and look at it if you want on your own. And just a personal comment about chess.com. So I have it in the chess.com engine right now. And when I click on the game review, according to this, I should be rated 2350, okay? And my opponent is 2250, which we're not. So I don't know if they're like inflating that. I don't know. These game review ratings seem to have more padding than a king size mattress. I don't know, because I'm definitely not 2350 and my opponent's definitely not 2250. I mean, my accuracy was 94.2, his was 93.7. I guess we both played well. I mean, we were in book for a while. Maybe that's why it says that. I don't really know how accurate or inaccurate those numbers are. I don't know if that's a marketing thing, but it's a little hard for me to accept. But anyway, if you put the game in an engine, you'll see this is an example, though, of a very clean game. Neither one of us really made any major mistakes, maybe a couple of inaccuracies, but nobody blundered, not even really a single question mark move. Even though they said we each made one of those single question mark moves, I don't really think it is. I'm wondering if you don't play the best move and it's the third, like, I don't know, would they consider to be a question mark or a double question mark or an exclamation point is always a little bit different from what humans consider it to be. But I do agree with the engine as far as, this was a very, very clean game. Nobody really made any major mistakes. It did end up in a draw, which I'll talk about, but let's go through the game from the beginning. All right, so my opponent was rated 1831. And when you play a strong opponent, say anyone over 1800, regardless of what your rating is, you want to give them a good game and you don't want to be intimidated in any way, especially if your opponent is, say, much higher rated. My thinking is always, I'm going to give you a good game, win or lose. Maybe I'm expected to lose because you're a little higher rated than I am, but I'm not going to make it easy on you. And even if you win, I want you to walk out of the tournament hall saying, wow, this guy gave a really good game. So don't let them push you around. That's the main thing. And with that attitude, I've gotten a lot of draws that way, as you'll see in this game. My attitude isn't, I'm going to beat you, right? I'm going to beat you. I have to win. Now, you may say, well, why not? Because that's a little too much pressure. But your attitude should be, I'm going to give you a heck of a game. And, I'm going to push back. If you push, I'm going to push back. And when you have that attitude, I found my results against higher rated opponents was a lot better. So anyway, he opened with D4. And then I played E6, which is a favorite of mine. Usually I do knight F6, but when I play E6, it'll often transpose into like a Nimzo or a Queens anyway, which is what I want. But I didn't know this until recently. I thought it was just called playing E6 against D4. It actually has a name. It is called the Pirc Defense. I didn't know that. At least that's what the chess.com engine says. So D4 E6, one of my favorites, is actually the Pirc Defense, but I simply look at it as playing a move you would normally play in the Nimzo or Queen's Indian, but you do it first instead of knight F6. The reason I like E6, couple of reasons. After D4 E6, white might think, oh, he's allowing me the classic pawn center, so now I'm going to do, E4. So after D4 E6, E4, D5, I've now transposed into the French defense, which is a favorite of mine, but maybe white doesn't want to play the French defense. So I like E6 after D4 because number one, as I just explained, you can trick your opponent into playing a French defense. The second reason is it stops Trompowsky players because after D4, E6, they cannot play Bishop G5. Obviously, there's no point. The queen would take it, but there's no knight to pin, all right, or to attack. Right, because the Trompowsky is D4 knight F6, bishop g5. Obviously, if I play e6 first, you can't do that. And if I know it's a real hardcore Trempowsky player, I'll definitely play e6 first. As you'll see, and this is typical, this transposed into the Queen's Indian defense, which is a favorite of mine. Again, d4 e6 is the Horwitz defense. Didn't know that. You're always learning something. And it turns out we were in book for a while, and we end up with a standard Queen's Indian defense. So my bishops are on e7 and b7, right? It's fianchettoed, and I just did the infamous, or I don't know why am I saying infamous, the typical e4 knight hop, right? Knight from f6 to e4. And I took his knight on c3. Now, even if you don't know the position I'm talking about, doesn't really matter. But what was interesting here was that we're in a situation where he almost fell for a very, very common trap in the Queen's Indian defense. Now, Queen's Indian players will know what it is. When I go knight takes c3, it looks like if he goes knight g5, it's like a tactical thing because my bishop on b7 is attacked and he's threatening me, but it doesn't work because black has this knight e2, knight takes e2 check. And I knew this trap well, but here's an interesting thing. Here's one of the first takeaways. Even higher rated opponents, say anybody over 1700 at the club, even players with ratings that high, they sometimes don't know some of these basic traps. Now, I don't know. Maybe he doesn't play the Queen's Indian as much. Maybe he forgot. Now, he didn't fall for it, but he almost did. And I really wanted him to do it because if he had played knight g5 here, if I go knight takes e2 check, it's instantly winning. Game would have been over. And he's looking. He's taking a lot of time on his clock. Like, right, we're talking about time pressure last week. Well, knowing your traps and all the openings you play, this would have saved him a lot of time. If he knew the theory, he would have been like, all right, I can't do knight g5. I simply need to take his knight on c3. But he's looking at it, and you know when your opponent, like you have a trap set, and you know the trap and he doesn't, and he's looking at it, and he's like itching to play it because he's probably thinking, ooh, I'm going to catch this guy early with this tactical thing. He didn't fall for it, though. I got to give him credit. I was like, ugh. I really wanted him to play it, but he simply recaptured the knight. And, you know, as I said, that the knight g5 trick doesn't work because I just go knight takes pawn check. Queen's Indian people know what I'm talking about. If you don't, it really doesn't matter. But the point I'm trying to make again is that even strong players sometimes don't know these basic traps, so you should know them. The next takeaway from this game is the importance of playing in the center and being aggressive when you can, especially not only against strong opponents. I mean, this could, you know, even if it's not a strong opponent, you always want to play in the center, but especially against these more positional d4 openings, because if you don't hit in the center, you're just going to get crushed. It's going to be like this positional vice. And I actually played d5 and then c5 one after the other, hitting at a center, right? I played d5 and then I immediately played c5. So hitting the center, not letting him get a hold on me. I was holding my own in this game, very positional game. If you put it in an engine, you'll see. I had played c5 on move 12. Again, doesn't matter if you don't see the position, but it's interesting. This is where we get into the engine. It really wasn't listed as the strongest move in the engine. It was actually towards the bottom, but it really made my opponent think, because you have to think humans, not engines. It really made him think, like, does he take, does he not take? Because when you create that pawn tension in the center, it's a lot of thinking. You know, do I trade? Do I not trade? Do I simply defend the pawn? Do I move a piece? What a lot of beginners do is every time this pawn tension, they take, right? So if I make a pawn move and it's attacking one of your pawns, they feel the need to take. They don't like having that pawn tension in the middle. Whereas I was comfortable with it because I know these positions. So I hit him with c5 and I said, all right, if he takes, I take back with the bishop. If he doesn't, I can actually take his pawn, but I'm chipping away at his center. His king is a little exposed because we had traded, he was fianchettoed on his king side. So when I did bishop takes g2, he did king takes g2, and his pawns are fianchettoed. So there's not a piece or a pawn on f3 or h3. So there's nothing immediate, but that could be a problem because the a8 h1 diagonal was open and his king was on it. So, you know, these are things you have to think about. There was nothing there now, but I really liked my position. Again, I played d5 and c5 in succession, hitting at a center. Very, very important concept. Always play in the center if you can. again, those D pawn openings especially, those can get very thorny if you have the black pieces, if you play a little bit too passively. All right, so the idea with C5, I'm probably going to follow up with maybe knight C6 or knight D7, depending on his response. And then the next theme is the idea of being aggressive against a higher rated opponent, right? Don't be passive or shy. If you see a move that's strong, don't be afraid to play it. So he had played this knight move attacking my bishop, but then I pushed my D pawn attacking his queen, and I end up getting a passed pawn. And I saw that if he takes my bishop back, that I can simply take back with the pawn. You know, these are different ideas that I'm looking at. But he made this knight move a little bit of an inaccuracy, not a blunder, but it allowed me to not only push a pawn to attack his queen, but it's now a passed pawn. So that can be an issue. And my queen is on the open file. I still have to develop my knight. He still has to develop his bishop. My position's very good. I got a real good opening out of this Queen's Indian. And that may have been he wasn't too sure of the middle game ideas in the Queen's Indian. Maybe he was expecting something else. I'm not sure. Although he did play D4 and C4, so he should expect that, but whatever. So anyway, I'm playing a little aggressively now. Excuse me. I'm hitting in the center. I'm attacking his queen. I have a passed pawn. Very important, and I'm forcing him to think, use up clock time. So I was very happy with my play. It's always easier to do when it's a position and an opening that you're familiar with, but he really wasn't giving me too many problems here, except for this sequence coming up. I should say up until this point in the game, he really wasn't creating too many problems for me. But then what happened here was we had a little bit of an exchange sequence, and I really had to think. Now, don't confuse this with what I said in the episode last week about time pressure and how with exchange sequences, the obvious recapture is usually correct. That's true. But in some positions, such as this one, you really have to analyze what you recapture with. In other words, use the time if you need it. What I was referring to last week was people taking a lot of time on recaptures when there's really not much to calculate, when it's really straightforward. This position was a little bit different. And I had to figure out how to recapture. So I recaptured with the pawn instead of a queen. And then I made a really, really strong positional move where I moved my queen to E7, defending the pawn. And I basically have a connected passed pawn in the middle. It's not winning or anything because he can hold it, but it's something. It's something to work with. And my position's good. So I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, all right, I need to develop my B8 knight and connect my rooks, get the rooks in the center. Maybe there's something pushing the passed pawn. His king is still a little bit vulnerable on G2. So, is there a check with the queen that can fork something else? These are all things you have to look at. What are his ideas? All right, he's going to look to develop his dark squared bishop. And, these are all different things I'm looking at, but I'm very happy with my position. But the takeaway from all this is that with exchange sequences, when it's not straightforward and there is some tactics involved and you can take with different pieces, then you should use some time on your clock. There you do need to analyze. Like this was an example where I really needed to analyze and look at it thoroughly. The exchange sequences earlier in the game out of the opening, those I didn't need to spend time on because they were very straightforward. These were a little tricky because they're more positional in nature because you don't want to do an even exchange, but then he has a huge positional advantage and he can kind of grind you down or it's going to kind of wear you out for the whole game. I took back with the pawn instead of the queen, and then I moved my queen to E7, defending the pawn and also attacking an undefended pawn of his. So I really like my position. I mean, it's still basically equal according to the engine, but from a human perspective, I felt black was better, if that makes sense. I know the engine says it was equal, but as far as two humans looking at it, I think most people would look at this position and say, black seems a little bit better here. All right, so now we're going to jump to the endgame. So basically, we each have 5 pawns and 2 rooks, okay, and a king, obviously. So rook and pawn ending, we're going to talk about rook and pawn endings in a bit. But one of the main themes in the endgame is that your king has to be active. You want an active king. Obviously, in the middle game and in the opening, you want a castle. You want to keep your king safe because with the queen and the heavy pieces on the board, you can get mated. The king basically does a 180 in the endgame. It's an active piece. It defends squares. It attacks pawns. It can defend a rook. It can block a rook from coming into an open file. So you want to get your king active. And the one sort of imbalance, the one little difference or advantage I had, I did have a passed pawn on d4, which is not immediately winning, but it's something. And he's defending it. And one takeaway I will tell you in rook and pawn endings, if you have a passed pawn, if you push it prematurely, if you try to force it to queen, you may end up losing it. You got to be very careful because that's all well and good that you have a passed pawn, but if he can defend it with his rooks and his king and you overpress, he may have more pieces on it than you do and you're going to end up losing it. So you got to be very careful when you push it. And right now I was defending it with one rook and I simply moved my king 3 times in a row. So he moves his rook to defend or to attack, I should say, my passed pawn. I move my king. He then moves his rook up to double. Guess what? I move my king again. He moves his other rook over. I move my king a third time. And you may say, well, if he's attacking your passed pawn twice, why are you only defending it once? That's the thing with rook and pawn endings. You can look for counterplay because if he takes my pawn, I take his rook and then he takes my rook and then I have a check with my rook and then I win one of his pawns on the A file. So one of the themes with rook and pawn endings is that you can look for counterplay. In other words, do I simply defend passively or can I let him take my pawn, but then I take his pawn and I get a better position, that type of thing. So you really have to analyze. Now, rook and pawn endings in general are very difficult. They're very tricky. Even for grandmasters, they're tricky. And why are they tricky? They're just very, very hard to win because it's hard to really push your own agenda without stopping his counterplay as well. Because that's what happens is you go forward with your own plans, but then he has counterplay with his rooks. So, that's why you've heard that saying, all rook endings are drawn. It's because they're very, very hard to win. And so what I was doing here was I was simply counterattacking. So he attacks my passed pawn, and then I just moved my rook over to attack his other one. So if his rook takes my pawn, then mine would take his pawn. And right now it's still even. It's still drawish, but we were both in a bit of time pressure here. We both had about 3 minutes on our clock with a 10-second delay. Now, 3 minutes with a 10-second delay for a rook and pawn ending, that's pretty even. That's not a lot of time. That's not a lot of time at all. It turns out we do some trades here. I end up with a passed pawn on the A file. I have an outside passed pawn and we each have one rook. And I really wanted to continue and go for the win. But here's where the whole draw offer thing comes in. Now, I wanted the win. I did not want to draw. He's a strong opponent. And I felt that outside passed pawn could be something. But here's what's funny. I read the position as this is completely drawn because the problem is I can't sort of push my passed pawn and queen it because he has counterplay in the middle. Like he can defend it also. Like it may look like if you look at this position at the very end where we agreed to the draw, and I'll explain how that happened, you might say, well, why did you offer the draw then? Now, first of all, even the engine says it's 0.00. That's literally what it says. Okay. This is a literal engine draw. It literally says 0.00, not even 0.001. So when I read this at the club as a complete draw, I was kind of happy that my read was correct, even though from a human standpoint, it might be different. So the problem was a couple of things going on here. And this is where when the chess coaches say, don't ever take a draw, this is what they forget. I was exhausted. Okay. This is at night after work. And I was really starting to feel it. And I really wanted to play for the win though. I wanted not just the rating points, but I just for the integrity of the game, I really wanted to win. And I've been doing well in this tournament. We have one round, left next week. I really did not want to draw. So I had my episode on draw offers. Remember, that is a plan B. I really did not want to draw. So what I did was I offered him a draw. And you may say, wait a minute, you just said you didn't want to draw. Why did you offer him a draw? Yeah, that's the whole thing. That's from the John M's book, the Survival Guide to Competitive Chess, where he talks about offering a draw even if you don't want one. They call that, or I call that, an offensive draw offer, where this is what my thinking was. I was exhausted and I was also concerned about time. I know he was too. We had less than 3 minutes. And I know myself, I don't have the skill for that I can really calculate what I need in that amount of time, especially when I'm tired. But I was willing to play it out. So I offered him the draw, almost hoping he wouldn't accept it. Like I almost wanted him to say no. I thought he was going to say no. I call that an offensive draw offer because you're kind of just getting information, like what's he going to do? It's sort of like a pro bet in poker. Like you put out a small little bet just to kind of see where he's at. My thinking was, if he doesn't accept the draw, you know what? I'm okay playing on. It's going to be tough, but I'm okay. It's one of these positions where I might win, but I can't lose, right? Because I have that outside pass pawn. It's definitely drawish, but I might win. So I kind of wanted to play on, but I'm tired and I'm not really good in time pressure. So I offered the draw to my higher rated opponent. If he were lower rated or much lower rated, I would not have offered the draw. I would have definitely played on. But I offered it, I said, let me see. And he thought about it just for a few moments. He accepted. And I said, you know what? Okay, I'm going to get some rating points out of it. It was drawn anyway. I really wanted to play for the win, but I was, all these things are going on in my mind. I thought that was a decent draw offer. It was probably drawn anyway. But as my opponent said in the postmortem, and I agree, because we basically agreed, this was before we put it in the engine. This is at the club. We basically agreed that, yeah, it's probably drawn. Maybe black's a little bit better, but he made a good point. He goes, if black tries to push too much here, white could actually win. And I agree completely. I told him I was thinking the same thing, right? Because he had these connected pawns in the center and his king. So this was all going on in my head when I offered the draw. So it turns out my read was correct. I mean, yeah, people are going to argue, you know what? It doesn't matter. You should have played on. That's fine. And then as far as, if you don't play it out, you're not going to learn anything. Yeah, but if I'm playing it out in time pressure and then making horrible moves because I have no time on my clock, how is that really learning anything? Yeah, you know what I learned? I learned that I'm horrible in time pressure and the draw offer was correct. Yeah, it just bothers me when people say that. Like, if you accept a draw, you're not going to learn anything. Yeah, that's only if you're accepting the draw, like on move 10, as I mentioned in the beginning of the episode. But people who say, like, if it's a 50-move game and you agree to a draw, oh, why'd you agree to the draw? You're not going to learn anything. Yeah, pal, I got 50 moves that were played already. There's plenty to learn. I'll be fine, okay? Carry on with your day. Anyway, didn't mean to babble, but that's sort of a stream of consciousness of what was going on in my head when I offered the draw. And like I said, in a way, I almost didn't want him to accept it, but I'm happy with it. I got a draw. I'm not going to say with black, because that whole with black, with white is nonsense at the amateur level. What I'm going to say is I got a draw against a strong opponent, and I played well. It was a very clean game. If you put it in the engine, you'll see it's kind of just a very clean positional game. And I just think it's hysterical that when we agreed to a draw, the computer actually says 0.00, and that's for all 4 moves. I have like 4 lines going. All 4 possible lines is 0.00. So again, it's just a question of, who's going to blunder. But that's the thing. Some guys will be like, oh, well, just, even though you only have 3 minutes, just play it out because maybe he'll blunder. Yeah, but maybe you'll blunder. Now, if I wasn't as tired as I was feeling, or if he denied the draw, then I would have played it out. But another night, I would not have offered the draw. Depending on my mood on the clock, you kind of have to go by that. You can't, see, this is the problem with having an absolute philosophy of no draws ever, because there are times when, like I said, depending on how you're feeling and what's going on in your mind and the clock, it might make sense. So that idea of draw offers and time pressure and how you're feeling, that was also a big takeaway from this game. So I hope I didn't babble too much there, but I kind of wanted to give you an idea of my thought process and what my thought process was during the game. My opponent's point about how if I had tried too hard to win there and overpressed, that he might have won the game, I think that was very well said. So that's another takeaway. Very interesting game, very instructive. Thank you again for the emails this week. 2 very interesting emails. Appreciate all the comments. Thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate everybody. And as always, I hope you win your next game. Have a great day.